Sundays are just more special than others. You realize that today is National Cheeseburger Day? We should be serving that at First Stop in McClure Hall. Just smell cheeseburgers wafting through. I can see the back rows emptying out when they banned the smell that. So I hope you enjoy cheeseburger today, whoever came up with that idea. Probably not Chick-fil-A. But this is more than that. It's like a confluence of stars. This is also National Back to Church Sunday. Who knew there was such a day? But you obviously knew. Here you are. Hey, welcome back to church. Whether you're online or here, this is the celebration, National Back to Church Sunday. Hope you'll also come next Sunday when it's not that day. But more than that, it's also National Wife Appreciation Day. Who knew there was such a day? So you got just this afternoon to run by CVS to get yourself a card, guys. National Wife Appreciation. Connie, I love you so much. It's been quite a week in all kinds of ways. She was 96 years old, matriarch, beloved. Everyone knew it was coming, but 96, and now everyone, the children come rushing there toward the end, and 8 grandchildren in vigil around. I'm not talking about Queen Elizabeth. It's Louise Keithley, my mother-in-law, who, as Doug mentioned, last Sunday, while we were in worship, went from daughters praying around her in a huddle and finished that prayer in the midst of glory. And God took her home after an incredibly glorious, raucous ride. Life is not measured by length. If it was, it'd be a great life, but life is measured by depth, and in that way, hers was even a greater life. And I had planned to preach on in-laws months ago, little knowing that she would pass away the week before, a few days before this sermon. But this is not influenced by her death. I can tell you, and told her during her life, I loved my mother-in-law. Now that might make me fairly strange, right? If you just Google up mother-in-law jokes, there's one book called 1,000 Mother-in-Law Jokes, and none of them are complimentary to mothers-in-law, right? There's actually a Mother-in-Law's Day, only 5 more shopping weeks until Mother-in-Law's Day. There's October 23rd. You may not know there was such a thing, but if you've got a mother-in-law, you might need to know that now, and I'm giving you a heads up. It was originally coined and created, it was in March in that day, in 1934. Gene Howell was the editor of the Amarillo Post, Amarillo, Texas, and he had this article that he wrote, this little op-ed that he called The Tactless Texan, as many Texans are, and he loved to poke fun at things. Well, one time, he wrote an article, an essay that poked fun at mothers-in-law, and he went too far. And so suddenly his mother-in-law and every other mother-in-law in Amarillo rose up in defiance against him, and finally, to save his job and maybe his life, he wrote an apology editorial, and he declared as an apology National Mothers-in-Law Day, not thinking it would take off, but Eleanor Roosevelt showed up, and so they held it in March that year. Unfortunately, it's the very same day as the Amarillo Fat Stock Show, and so with good wisdom, they moved it to October, so they wouldn't coincide with that day. But anyway, there's a Mothers-in-Law Day. Now, what's odd about that, of course, is so often people have really, tense relationships with their in-laws. I read an article, a survey, said that 70% of people would report that there's been some tension in their family life, their marriage life, because of the various in-laws, whether it's daughters, sons-in-law, sisters-in-law, mother, fathers-in-law. How many of you are like that 70%? The majority say, it was tense sometimes. How many would you say that was true for you? Yeah, okay. Not a one of you, because you know we're on TV and she might be watching. I get it. All right. Well, actually, I would be like you. I would have to say, wow, I just loved my mother and father-in-law. But in-law relationships are often really, really tense, right? I play golf with some buddies, and when you hit one of those golf shots, maybe you don't do it, but I do it from time to time, where it just kind of squirts off to the right, doesn't do what you thought. My golf buddies call that a son-in-law shot. And I said, what's a son-in-law shot? He said, well, it's not what you had hoped, but it's not as bad as it could have been. And many a father who thinks nobody's good enough to marry their daughter knows what I'm talking about. That I've got a good friend and neighbor and just really dear friend of mine here in Florida who tells a story about where their child was falling in love with this guy and they didn't think he was the right guy. You know, sometimes parents feel like they know best and wishing we could do arranged marriages, but they could just see this is going nowhere good. But you know how daughters can be sometimes, headstrong, and they went ahead and married, and sure enough, it did not go well. It was really even worse than the parents had thought it might be. And he told me once, he said, I offered that guy $10,000 before the wedding just to go. And he looked at me dead-faced and he said, it's the biggest mistake I ever made. I should have offered him $20,000. I love that story. So yeah, okay. Sometimes it can be tense, in-law relationships, but the most tense of them all, usually, statistically, is between daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law. They're in love with the same guy, but see him in very different ways. One can never stop seeing him as her precious little prince boy, and the other one sees him as her husband and as a man, and sharing him and figuring out how to love him brings about sometimes a good bit of tension. Often a lot of and yet, you know what's odd? In the Bible, there are some tense in-law relationships. Most of the time in the Bible, in-law relationships, unlike today, are very, very warm. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, was actually one of the people, along with Joshua, who held up Moses' arms on one of those battles when Moses just couldn't keep holding his arms up. They had to stay up to win the battle. And Jethro was right there holding up Moses' arm. Jethro was the one who told Moses, this is getting too big for you. You need to assign 70 elders and help Moses figure out how to lead. That was a great relationship. Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, who not only was his mother-in-law, but lived with them. You think Peter might have said, Lord, just finish her off. But no, it was help heal her. And when she rose up out of that healing, she rose to serve them because that was the kind of woman she was. So most of the in-law relationships in the Bible are actually pretty tight and pretty warm. Maybe you're having those biblical relationships too. Well, let me tell you a love story. In 1948, Louise Drennan and Carmen Keithley, my mother and father-in-law, married. He went off to Korea for a little bit, but he came back, and they began this lifelong love story, 66 years together, and it was not just long, it was deep. I'm not sure if Queen Elizabeth's long marriage was quite as warm. I can't tell really, but I tell you, Carmen and Louise Keithley had a love relationship. But like every great love story, there was some pain in it. They wanted so much to have a child, and God granted them a child. Didn't seem to be a thing wrong with all of that. After the birth, a few hours later, Carmen went on back to work. Everything seemed fine. Got the call that suddenly the child had passed away. Enormous heartbreak. You wonder, where's God in all of this, right? And they prayed to God, people of great faith. They prayed to God, Lord, would you just, in your mercy, would you give us another daughter? And he did. But as Carmen loved to tell the story, he not only did that, he gave us one of each kind he had, because they had a brunette and a blonde and a redhead, those three daughters. And I'm married to the middle of them, the feisty dynamo Connie, the blonde. And so God just blessed them in that wonderful way. But in the middle of every great love story, there is some pain. I don't know if it was in their wedding, but in many weddings that I have performed, maybe in some of your weddings, there was this great phrase from Scripture that it kind of fits for a husband and wife to be talking to each other, surrounded by their favorite people, full of vim and promise, and they say to each other these wonderful vows, entreat me not to leave you. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you go, I'll be with you. Even death won't separate us. Have you ever heard that phrase out of the book of Ruth? How many of you had that either read at your wedding or heard it at a wedding sometime? Very, very popular. The most popular few verses in the book of Ruth. It's our text for this morning, but it was not originally said between a husband and a wife at the altar, surrounded by a bunch of friends getting ready to go to a reception. It was said from a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law. These are in-law words. Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16. Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you, Ruth said to Naomi. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And the words of Ruth the Moabite to her mother-in-law Naomi, the Jew. So what's the context? It's this. The book of Ruth is this wonderful story tucked in there. You know, not many people are named Ruth anymore, right? I got to thinking of which Ruths that I knew. In the 1920s, it was the third most popular girl's name in the U.S. And you think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, probably born about during that time, or Dr. Ruth, probably the same thing, or even more famously, my mother, Mary Ruth Walworth. So those are the three Ruths that I know. But that's a great and wonderful name. Used to be even more popular than today. But the story of Ruth is a story that it's a love story, but it's not so much a love story about Ruth and her eventual husband, Boaz, so that's how it ends. It's a love story between two women. Love in the sense of steady, solid, steadfast, stubborn love for each other and companionship, and a reflection, therefore, of the great love of God that seems to surround it, even if in the shadows. So here's the story, if you don't know it. Naomi and Abimelech live in Bethlehem. First time that town is mentioned in the Bible, but it will get mentioned a few more times after this. You may have heard of Bethlehem. They live in Bethlehem, a few miles southeast of Jerusalem, and there is a famine that has swept over Bethlehem. And so, like many people to this very day, they leave the land where they are in search of where there might be more food and promise. They gather up their family, they cross the river, and they go to be migrants, to kind of try to make their way into a new land. Some countries don't feel good about that when people do that. But that's what they did. They went from Israel to the neighboring community or town or country of Moab. And they had two sons, did Abimelech and Naomi, Mahlon and Chilion. And so they go, these three. When they get there, though, soon after getting there, Abimelech dies. He dies. Now, apparently, Naomi and Abimelech had a really beautiful, loving relationship. I say that because of the enormous grief that consumes Naomi. There are people who have the love of their life who dies, and they are left with so much love still that sits in them heavy like a rock of grief, right? There are also those who have long since had the love die, but the guy or the gal is still alive. And that's a grief too. Who's more lonely? The person who sleeps alone and reaches across to where there used to be somebody and now it's a cold sheet? Or is it the person who sleeps awake at night next to somebody that they wish they were somewhere else? For Naomi, it was the love of her life who was gone, but her love is still there. And the price of her great love is great grief. Well, she has two sons, so at least she has that. And this is a patriarchal world where a woman's identity and her security is tied up in being related to some male. A woman had to be somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's mother, or she was really vulnerable. So there's these two boys, and they marry two Moabite women in this new country where they live, two Moabites. So by the way, think of how amazing that was, because good Jewish boys weren't supposed to marry Moabites and vice versa. If you know the story about Moab, you remember Abraham and Lot? You know? And so they're nephew and uncle, but they can't get along. You know, the businesses, so they have to separate, and Lot chose this fertile valley with some big cities like Sodom and Gomorrah. You may have heard of those, and he went to go live there, and Abraham stayed in the highlands. And then the wickedness of Sodom, you may have heard the word sodomy. The word wickedness of Sodom Sodom rose up before God. He's going to destroy the cities, but he sends angels, to go rescue Lot and his family for the sake of Abraham. The men of Sodom want to take those angels, thinking they're men, to do their own vile work with. Anyway, that didn't happen, but they finally get Lot and his daughters out. They hide in a cave. Sodom and Gomorrah are toast. In the cave, the two daughters of Lot say, you know, now what are we going to do? How are we going to ever have children? It's just us now with our daddy. Believe it or not, they concocted the idea, let's get daddy drunk and maybe we can have a child by daddy. And I mean, they both did that. And the name of the oldest one's child was named Moab, hence the people of the Moabites. And the youngest one's child was called Amnon, and they became the Ammonites in current day Jordan. And that's where Naomi's family went. And there was always, ever since those really shadowy past, a lot of don't go there stuff in Israel's history. They went to Moab. And amazingly, with all of that enmity between those countries, that somehow both the families of Orpah and Ruth and Abimelech and Naomi, they somehow allowed their kids to fall in love and marry over that kind of trained national and racism against that other group. That's amazing, really, that even happened, but it did. Well, here's what tragedy is. Then the sons, both of them, died. They'd been married 10 years to those two girls, but both sons died, leaving no children. So now it's Naomi with no husband and no children and no grandchildren. Only these two foreigner daughters-in-law. She's heard in the meantime that the famine has eased back in Bethlehem, and she decides, let me just go back home and die there because it's all gone. My life is empty. The daughters-in-law actually want to go with her, which is amazing. She begs them not to, says, girls, you're still young and attractive. Go back to your own people. Get on a dating app. Find somebody else. And finally, she insists enough that Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, does that. But Ruth won't do it. What Naomi says to them makes every sense in the world, actually. Ruth just won't do it. What is it about the relationship with Naomi that makes Ruth be willing to leave everything she knows, all of her people, to go to a place she doesn't know except she's been trained they don't like us, to follow her mother-in-law who has no prospects whatsoever to offer her? In fact, Naomi says, what are you doing? I'm not going to have another child, and even if I did, by the time that child grew up, you'd be too old. There's nothing I can give you. And Ruth just says, I'm going. Where you go, I'm going to go. Where you lodge, I'm going to lodge. Where you die, I'm going to die. Your people going to be my people, and your God, my God. I wonder what she had learned about Naomi's God while she was living in that family, right? I learned more about my God by being around Connie's family. I remember when I came into the family, her sisters were not too sure that I was the right idea. But Mr. and Miss Keithley basically said, whoever she loves, we're going to love. Girls, get on with it. And so I came into the family on the wings of their blessing. And that's the way God does. God's always sweeping up somebody and calling them family, right? I wonder if that's you. So Naomi and Ruth make their way back to Bethlehem. They come into town. The people say, is that Naomi? Well, I think so. But, of course, she looked haggard now after all of that loss. And she said, don't call me Naomi. Her name means pleasant one. I'm not pleasant. You call me Mara from now on, which means bitter. I'm bitter. I went away full. I've come back empty, which is sad because in her loss, and this happens when people are grieving, she'd lost so much that she can't even see the faithfulness of Ruth standing right beside her. I don't have anybody. I'm alone. I'm empty. And there's Ruth. The truth is, even though it feels totally lost and empty when you've lost much, you've never actually lost everything. And Ruth is such a good friend, and here's the beginning of the great story. Here's what a really great friend does. A great friend sticks with you even when they can't give you anything back. They look past the bitterness to see what is actually loneliness. And loving Naomi at this point was like hugging a porcupine. I mean, you get nicked up if you get close to someone like this, but Ruth was willing to do it. Maybe living with Naomi had taught her something about this God Yahweh. Maybe she was so willing to find out more about this God and the kind of relationship, a God who actually has hesed or steadfast love for his people. That's the kind of God that they talked about, and her Moabite gods weren't that way, I assure you. Maybe that's what made her risk. We talk about Abraham, how great a father of faith he was, and he was. How he left because God said, pick up Abraham, go leave Ur of the Chaldees, go to a land, I'll tell you when you get there. Okay, that's a real great act of faith. But Abraham was a male in a male-dominated world. Abraham already had a wife and a whole lot of possessions. And Abraham had a direct vision and word from God to do it. Still took faith, but think about Ruth. She's still in that man's world, and she's a woman. She is penniless and attached to someone who's also penniless with no prospects, and she doesn't have a single angel or word from God telling her to do it. And yet she lives out the very faithfulness of God and becomes sort of a sign to Israel about what the God of Israel was already like. She lives it out. Often throughout the whole book of Ruth, God never seems to step in. Naomi feels like God's left her, which is how grief feels, but actually God's moving through every bit of the story. He's present through the faithfulness of Ruth. And here's what's cool about it. The name Ruth means friend, compassionate friend. And could there be more different women? Not only mother-in-law, daughter-in-law stuff, that's a lot to get over, but when they lost the man that connected them, now they decided, well, let's try as friends. Now, they're different ages, they're a generation apart, they're different cultures, different religions, different nations, and yet somehow that was the friend brought into Naomi's life. Friends, who is it that has been for you, or who might you be for somebody else, that unexpected friend that would be God's gift just when you desperately need it? To whom have you been a Ruth? Who's been a Ruth to you? And it's especially wonderful when it's someone who stretches across, it's easy to be friends with people who are just like you, who have the same political signs in their front yard and who are from the same state and know how to say the Lord's Prayer without looking. It's just easy to be friends with people who are like you. But have you had a friend who was not like you? It's an odd couple kind of friendship. But like Ruth and Naomi, it's God's great gift. There's some of these in history. James Longstreet was a rebel general under Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant, obviously the general for the Union Army. But they were cadet friends at West Point in the 1840s. Now the 1860s, they're on opposite sides. But they were best friends at West Point and maintained their friendship even though they were separated by blue and gray. And it was Longstreet, as a key lieutenant to Robert E. Lee, who convinced Robert E. Lee to be willing to surrender to Grant at Appomattox, assuring him, because he knew the heart of his friend, that Grant would have terms that would be gentle and appropriate for both Lee and, more importantly for Lee, for his men. So that friend, and then after the war, in fact, when they came up at Appomattox, Grant went over to Longstreet and said, "Hello, my good friend, let's have a game of cards when this is all done," just like the old days. Their friendship lasted through, beyond, and after even the Civil War. Or in politics, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, different ends of the political spectrum, no question about that, but they were great friends. They saw in each other the essential American and patriot and person who loved, and they came at it from very different ways and thought about stuff, but what they had in common they thought was more important than how they differed. And when Reagan, this attempted assassination of Reagan, it was Tip O'Neill who was there at his hospital, not only that, kneeling beside his bed praying for his friend. And when Tip O'Neill died, it was Ronald Reagan leading the fundraising efforts to raise the money to endow a chair at Tip O'Neill's alma mater. A friendship that transcended their differences. Or Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Really different kind of ways, but in that little club of ex-presidents, they became so close especially. Now the Bush children call Bill Uncle Bill. They joke around with each other and they visit with each other. I would give a modern day example, but I can't think of any in the modern day Congress. But isn't it beautiful and wonderful when different people that you would never have put together, like in-laws, become more than just friends? Oh, dear ones, don't restrict your world only to the people who look like you, because you're going to miss the Ruth in your life when you most need it. Do you have that kind of friend? Faithful and bold. Way later, Ruth is going to end up falling in love with Boaz, a kinsman, and Naomi ends up sort of directing all that. Actually, it's kind of like the dating app of the day was to go lay at the threshing floor, and Ruth actually proposes to Boaz. He was that slow on the draw, and so she finally has to take matters into her own hands. But the point is, they have a child named Obed, who has a child named Jesse, who has a child named David, and that's King David, the great king over Israel. And the story is really told in the Bible to say how in the world our great King David actually has a Moabite great-grandmother. And not only is that part of the story, because David was no more pure stock than any of us. If we were in the Westminster Dog Show, we'd all be in the mutt category, you know. And so's David. And the Gospel of Matthew traces not only the lineage of David, the lineage of Jesus. And pauses and circles over and said, and then there was Obed, whose mother was Ruth, the Moabitess. And then he goes all the way down to Jesus, who also had a habit of collecting up people who normally shouldn't like each other at all. Even his 12 disciples, apart from Jesus, would be at fisticuffs with each other, if not knives. But Jesus taught people to look for what you hold in common and overlook the things that are different. The differences are there. As Paul would say in Galatians 3:28, in Christ, there's neither male nor female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. Those are there, they just don't matter so much. Because in Christ, we have more in common than different. Is it time to expand your world and maybe even expand your reach? The world could use more Ruths. It's already ruthless enough, right? Could you be that person? And thank God for who that person was in your life. On the last night of Jesus' life, gathering that ragtag bunch that only he could have pulled together, he said to them, I don't call you servants, even disciples anymore. From now on, you're my friends. And I invite you to be friends to each other. And every time you do it, every time you practice that hesed, that loving kindness, stubborn, steady, give yourself away kindness to each other, in whatever relationships, you'll feel the smile, if not the teardrop of God, that somebody finally did with their love what he had done with his.
Look at the world.